The studio lights in New York were blinding. Everything gleamed, the polished floors, the slick cameras, even the suits. Behind the panelists, a row of world flags waved gently, as if diplomacy itself were watching. The event was called Future Voices, a slick production meant to spark global conversation between rising leaders. But beneath all that polish, something raw was about to unfold. On one end of the table sat Ibrahim Traoré, not in military fatigues, not behind a podium, in Burkina Faso, but in a clean charcoal suit. He sat tall, composed, and quiet. A man who'd survived real battles didn't need to raise his voice. His silence said enough. Across from him was Barron Trump, fresh-faced, confident, and unmistakably his father's son. Just 19 and already fluent in the language of sound bites. He leaned into his mic with the kind of energy that fills a room but doesn't settle in it. "I think we need to stop glorifying people like Traoré," Barron said, barely looking his way. "You can dress up a dictator, but it's still a dictator." The room tensed. A few heads turned toward Traoré, waiting. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Just leaned in slightly and said evenly, "I came here to talk about the future. You came to perform your father's past." Barron raised, his brows amused. "No disrespect, Mr. Traoré, but when you take power by force, you lose the right to lecture on democracy. Maybe where you're from, power is seized. Here, it's earned." For a moment, nothing moved. Then Traoré sat, back, calm as a lake before a storm. "Sit down, kid," he said, his voice cool and cutting. "The adults are talking." It hit the room like thunder. A cameraman fumbled. Someone in the back gasped. One panelist choked on a laugh. Barron looked stunned, unsure if he'd just been scolded, humiliated, or both. The moderator jumped in, trying to steer the conversation. "Let's, shift to foreign aid policy." But Traoré raised one hand. "I'll answer, but let's be clear," he said, eyes still locked on Barron. "This isn't a stage for dynasties. It's a mirror for reality." You could feel the shift. Suddenly, everyone was listening, not to a name, but to a man who didn't bow to names. Barron tried to regain ground. "I have every right to be here," he said. "I was invited just like you." "And you spoke," Traoré nodded, like someone who thinks history began when they got their first passport. Laughter bubbled from one side of the panel. Even Senator Lam, known for his poker face, hid a grin. Barron's voice hardened. "I've studied global politics. I know what freedom means. I don't need a lecture from someone who censors journalists." Traoré didn't even blink. "You've studied us through the headlines written by the people who sell you your news. That's not education. That's curated ignorance." The moderator tried again, voice tight. "Let's stay respectful." But Traoré didn't raise his tone. Respect isn't silence. It's listening. Something hard to do when you've never had to fight for the truth, only scroll past it. Barron leaned back, trying to laugh it off. "So now I'm just a rich kid with a phone?" "No," Traoré said without missing a beat. "You're a symbol. Not of evil, of something more dangerous, entitlement without sacrifice. Power without scars." And in that moment, every inch of the glossy set, every carefully placed flag, every producer behind the glass, fell still. Even Caroline Levitt, seated nearby, looked like she was about to jump in, but by then everyone knew. Barron had walked in thinking he was the sharpest voice in the room. But Traoré, he walked in carrying the weight of a nation, and left carrying the room. Traoré wasn't just a president. He was a soldier once. He understood power not from books, but from the battlefield. When he finally turned his gaze toward Caroline Levitt, sharp, measured, the entire studio seemed to freeze. "And yet," he said quietly, "here I am, speaking, not shooting." The air thickened. "I came here to build bridges," he added, But if the only tools I'm handed are bricks soaked in arrogance, don't be surprised if one of them comes flying back. You could hear a pin drop. Barron Trump, seated just across from him, instinctively glanced at his fellow panelists, hoping for backup. Nothing. No nods. No smirks. Just silence. Even the confidence in his posture began to falter. He looked to the camera, the way people do when they realize they've lost the room, hoping the online crowd still had his back. They didn't. On social media, the tides had already turned. Hashtags like Chatra Sit Down Kid and Traoré Clapped Back were trending. The memes were funny, yes, but what mattered more were the real questions starting to surface. Why did he speak to a sitting African president like that? Is this what America's future leadership looks like? Smug and untested? And that's when it became clear. Traoré hadn't just silenced a Trump. He had peeled back the curtain on something deeper, the fragility of inherited confidence. The moderator tried to steady the energy. He cleared his throat, this time, with real discomfort. President Traoré, we understand this is emotional, but surely I'm not emotional, Traoré interrupted, calm as ever. I'm focused. There's a difference. His voice softened, but every word hit like a drum beat. Focus builds nations. Emotion builds tweets. He scanned the table, his gaze steady. Barron, Caroline, the others. And then he turned to the audience. I came here because I was told this was a dialogue, a bridge between generations. But let's be honest. Some showed up to pose, others came to provoke. He looked back at Barron. I didn't come to perform. I came because while you rehearse your father's legacy, my people are rebuilding from the ashes of someone else's. Barron opened his mouth again, trying for a comeback. You act like I'm clueless, just because I'm young. Traoré didn't flinch. No, I'm saying youth isn't an excuse to avoid responsibility, especially not when your last name gives you a microphone your mind isn't ready to hold. There was a sound from the back of the studio. A quiet clap. Then another. The moderator raised his hand, but the moment had already shifted. Behind them, the social media feed flashed across the massive screen. Traoré is speaking truth. This wasn't a debate. It was a reality check. Barron brought a smirk to a history lesson. In the control room, a producer whispered urgently into the moderator's earpiece, "Let it roll. The numbers are off the charts." Back on stage, Traoré leaned in again, not to attack, but to connect. I don't hate you, Barron, he said. In fact, I understand you. You were born into a system that told you you'd always be at the center of the room, that every table was already set for you. He paused. But that world, it's changing. And if you want to sit at the new table, you'll have to show up with your own story, not your father's shadow. Barron didn't respond. The grin was gone. And for the first time, the camera didn't catch confidence in his eyes, but something else. Doubt. Maybe even a little respect. Caroline Levitt leaned toward him and whispered something, but Barron didn't answer. He just sat still, realizing what everyone else already had. He didn't walk into a debate. He walked into a masterclass. Traoré finally turned back to the moderator. Next question, please. The audience didn't erupt into applause. They rose in something heavier. Respect. The moderator, clearly, rattled but recovering, adjusted his glasses and searched his tablet for the next question. Right, he said. President Traoré, what do you think is the biggest misconception Americans have about your leadership? Traoré didn't pause. That I'm the villain, he said, because I refuse to kneel. The room went still again. When I removed foreign troops from our land, they called me dangerous. When I claimed our gold, they called me corrupt. But when your corporations do the same on our soil, you call it policy. Barron stirred slightly but didn't speak. You see, Traoré added, his voice never rising, it's not that I broke the rules. It's that I refused your rules, the ones you wrote without asking us. And this time, one of the American panelists, Dr. Ellen Morse, leaned forward. President Traoré, she said, whether people agree with you or not, I don't think anyone will forget what just happened here today. A young analyst on the panel leaned forward, trying to strike a softer note. But surely there's value in global cooperation, she said. Self-reliance doesn't have to mean isolation. Traoré nodded. Of course. I believe in partnership, deeply, but not in obedience disguised as outreach. What we're often offered isn't help. It's control, dressed in the language of generosity. Barron cleared his throat. Then what do you want from the West? He asked, quieter now. What does a healthy relationship look like to you? Traoré turned to him. One word, he said. Respect. It hit the room like a gong. No speeches, no slogans, just the weight of that word. You want to trade? Traoré said. Trade fair. You want to help? Ask. Don't assume. You want to speak? Then listen first. Barron didn't speak. For once, he had no witty retort. He stared at his hands, then looked back up, not with defensiveness, but curiosity. Maybe you're right, he said softly. Maybe I came in thinking I knew more than I did. Traoré gave him a simple nod. That's not weakness, Barron. That's the beginning of wisdom. Not knowing, but knowing that you don't. Even the moderator seemed taken aback. The atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a political face-off was turning into something else, something harder to categorize. Across the globe, millions were watching in real time. The live stream chat had turned reflective. This is the dialogue we've been waiting for. Traoré's not just leading, he's mentoring. Barron's learning in front of all of us. And honestly, respect. Back inside the studio, you could feel it. The ego in the air had cooled. What replaced it wasn't defeat, it was understanding. Then came a pause. A short break was announced. Cameras zoomed out, microphones muted, but the room didn't relax. Producers scrambled in hushed tones. This is going viral. Barron stayed in his seat, unusually quiet. He scrolled through his phone. Every social platform was buzzing. Memes of Traoré's sit-down kid line had taken over. But what surprised him wasn't the mocking. It was the comments praising him for not storming out, for staying in the chair. He muttered, "Are they respecting me for not clapping back?" From across the table, Traoré heard him. Leadership, he said quietly, isn't about winning every exchange. It's knowing when silence says more than pride ever could. Barron looked up. How do you carry that? He asked. The way you speak, the presence. It's like you own the space. Traoré didn't pause. Because I've buried friends in it. Barron blinked. What do you mean? I'm not here because I won an election campaign. With nice slogans, Traoré said. I stood between armed men and a school full of children once. I led people with no armor but conviction. Power, real power, isn't an achievement. It's a wound that never fully heals. The room had gone completely still, and they weren't even back on air yet. Barron swallowed hard. I've never had to fight for anything, he said. That's not your fault, Traoré replied. But once you realize it, it becomes your responsibility. A producer held up fingers. 30 seconds to air. Then, Barron asked something unexpected. Why didn't you humiliate me? Traoré looked at him steady. Because if I had, I'd be no different than those I stand against. When the cameras came back on, the audience could feel the shift. This wasn't the same exchange from before. Something real had settled between them. Something earned. The moderator's voice cracked slightly as he returned to the questions. "President Traoré," he said, "some critics call you unbending, harsh, even the Iron Wall of Africa. What do you say to that?" Traoré didn't grin. He didn't wave it off. He just looked into the lens. "An iron wall," he said, "only rises when too many try to sneak in through the back door." The words rolled through the room like thunder, a phrase designed not to entertain, but to reveal. Even Barron looked stunned. But Traoré wasn't finished. "You ask why I don't compromise?" he continued. "Let me ask you this instead. Why should I compromise with those who only learned my name the day I said no? A beat. Then, compromise is noble, when both sides risk something. But too often, one side gives while the other just collects." He paused, letting the silence carry the weight. "That's not partnership. That's conquest. And I won't dress it up just to make others more comfortable." "You talk about cooperation," Traoré said, his voice steady, "but true partnership can only happen when both parties stand on equal ground." He let that linger for a beat before continuing. "When one shows up with a leash and the other with a backbone, that's not negotiation. That's colonization in a tailored suit." The panel fell into silence, not out of disagreement, but because no one had ever dared say it like that, especially not on live American television. Finally, Caroline Levitt, seated at the far end of the table, broke the tension. "You make it sound like you don't believe in diplomacy at all." Traoré turned toward her, calm but firm. "I believe in diplomacy. What I don't believe in is smiling for the cameras while signing away my country's future behind closed doors." There was a low ripple from the studio audience. A few murmurs, no rebuttals. Barron Trump just sat there, this time not like a contender waiting for his turn, but like a student watching someone rewrite the rules mid-lecture. "You think this is about politics?" Traoré continued. "This is about dignity, about whether people like me are allowed to speak without translation, about whether I can walk into a room like this and be seen, not as a visitor, but as a man who's earned his place." He turned toward Barron again. "And make no mistake, I earned it, with more blood than you'll see in a lifetime." The moderator tried to redirect the conversation, clearly rattled. "President Traoré, if you won't play by the traditional rules of engagement, then where does this lead? What's the endgame?" Traoré didn't even blink. "It doesn't end," he said quietly. "Because freedom has no finish line. You protect it, every day, from enemies, from friends, from forgetting. Up in the control room, chaos. Viewer numbers were spiking by the second. The studio chat was flooded with quotes, memes, and raw emotion. Traoré just changed the whole game. This isn't a debate anymore. It's a reckoning. Traoré speaks truth, and Sit Down Kid lit up screens across continents. Inside the studio, the entire energy had shifted. What started as a stage-managed political showcase had collapsed, and in its place stood something far more real. The man once dismissed as an outsider had become the center of moral gravity. Even Barron knew it. During the break, as technicians swarmed the set, Barron leaned forward, elbows on the table. His voice was low, nearly drowned out by the buzz. "I didn't come here expecting to respect you," he said. Traoré didn't flinch. "But I do now," Barron added. And for the first time, Traoré gave him something close to a smile. Not kind, not condescending, just earned. "You don't have to like me," he said, "but you do need to understand something. The world doesn't revolve around your flag." Barron nodded slowly. "That part, I'm still learning." "Good," Traoré replied. "That means you're finally waking up." When the cameras rolled again, the tone had changed, even for the viewers watching from home. This wasn't a clash anymore. It was something deeper. A young man, coming face to face with what real leadership looks like. The next question came from a journalist with the New York Times. President Traoré, she said carefully, critics say you dwell too much on the past, that your resistance to Western influence comes from old wounds. Isn't it time to move forward? Traoré turned to her, his voice calm but resolute. You don't bury a wound until it's healed, he said, and ours still bleeds every time a contract shows up with invisible ink. The journalist leaned in. So, you don't trust us? I trust intentions, he said, but I verify outcomes. And the outcomes, so far? They've mostly worked in your favor. Barron, surprisingly, spoke again. But what if some of us actually want to build something honest? What if we do want to get it right? Traoré looked him in the eye. Then stop speaking for us and start listening to us. There was another pause, not awkward, just real. Barron leaned back in his chair, his voice quieter now. Fair. The moderator didn't speak, neither did the audience. But behind the cameras, something was shifting. A security aide moved to the edge of the stage and whispered urgently into an earpiece. The moderator blinked, then spoke carefully. We've just received word. There are protests outside the building. Supporters and critics of President Traoré. It's escalating. All eyes turned to Traoré, waiting for a reaction. Defensive? Angry? Spinning? But he just sat back, hands folded, eyes steady. Let them protest, he said. It means they're awake. Outside, the crowds roared, some chanting, Stand with Traoré, and waving hand-painted signs. Others shouted back, demanding he be challenged. The streets were hot with passion, unfiltered, unrehearsed, and inside the studio, stillness. The world wasn't watching a television event anymore. They were watching a moment. It started like any other political show. Bright lights, heated panel, the usual suspects throwing around opinions like darts. Then President Ibrahim. Traoré walked in. Outside, chaos was brewing. Protesters clashed, some waving flags, others shouting slogans like, American values first. Police sirens howled. News helicopters buzzed overhead. Every major channel dropped their programming to cover what was unfolding. But inside the studio, things were even more intense. The air felt heavy. You could hear the silence. The moderator finally broke it. Mr. Traoré, your presence has clearly sparked division, even here in America. How do you respond to that? Traoré didn't blink. This didn't start with me, he said, calm but firm. It started the moment powerful nations decided they could write the world's story for everyone else. He motioned toward the chaos outside. They're not upset because of who I am. They're upset because I don't flinch when they raise their voices. I remind them, the world doesn't need Washington's permission to breathe. That line hit hard. Then something unexpected happened. Barron Trump, who had been sitting quietly, looked at the moderator and said, Maybe we should ask why people love or hate him the moment they see him. The moderator asked, And why do you think that is? Barron hesitated, then smiled, almost sheepishly. Because he earned his power. The rest of us, we inherited ours. The room froze. Even Traoré raised an eyebrow. The audience barely breathed. The moderator scrambled to shift the moment. Barron, do you regret saying that? Barron shook his head. No, because it's true. And sitting here tonight, I've realized something else. He looked down, then back up. This time, no performance, just honesty. I talk about patriotism, but I've never sacrificed for it, never lost a friend for it, never had to fight for my seat at the table. Then he turned to Traoré. But you have. No applause, no music. Just that kind of silence that feels sacred. When truth finally breaks through all the noise. And for a second, the man so often dismissed as just a kid wasn't reading from a script. He was speaking from his gut. Traoré didn't say much, just nodded once. And in that moment, it said more than any speech could. Then came the final question from the moderator. You've challenged everything we assume about leadership and power. But why come here? Why step into this storm? Traoré leaned in, his voice lower, slower. Because you can't change the system from the outside, not if the doors stay closed. So I walked in to crack it open. He looked around. The room not trying to charm anyone, just making sure they heard him. You don't have to like how I talk, but tonight you had to listen. And that's all I needed, to remind this country that leadership isn't passed down. It's lived. The studio was still, even his. Loudest critics were quiet now, not out of defeat, but reflection. Barron, now far from the cocky persona he started with, asked one last thing. When the cameras go off, and the world moves on, what then? Traoré gave a small smile. Then I raised my voice louder. He stood, paused, and looked back one last time. Don't confuse silence with surrender. Sometimes silence is just sharpening the blade. Then he left the stage. No music, no headlines screaming. Just people slowly standing one by one. A quiet ovation for something real. Backstage, a producer whispered, "We just witnessed the moment of the year." Outside, the shouting continued, but inside, something had shifted. And Barron, he didn't speak, just sat there, finally understanding. He turned to the moderator and said, "He wasn't here to win. He came here to teach." And teach he did. They told him to sit down. A young man, Barron Trump, stood before a global stage, full of inherited confidence and the weight of a name known everywhere. He expected applause. Instead, he got a lesson. That moment, captured on every screen, wasn't just political theater. It became something else entirely. News anchors spun it their way. Some called it a coming-of-age moment for Barron. Others cried foul, saying it embarrassed America. But the real impact wasn't on cable TV. It was in the minds of the young, those watching from classrooms, campus cafes, and phone screens. They weren't quoting Traoré because he was powerful. They were quoting him because he spoke a truth no one else dared to. Real power doesn't come from legacy. It comes from character. Thousands of miles away, in the heart of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré's motorcade rolled quietly through the streets of Ouagadougou. No red carpets, no flashing cameras, just barefoot children holding handmade flags, colors scribbled with love and hope, red, green, gold. He hadn't returned from a battle with guns, but his eyes carried the weight of war, the kind that's fought with dignity, not weapons. Back at the presidential residence, an aide handed him the debate transcript. Traoré read it in silence, pausing at one line. A small smile formed. "Don't mistake silence for surrender," the aide asked. Him gently, "Was it worth it, Mr. President?" Traoré didn't speak right away. He just looked out the window. Then came a reply, quiet but sharp as truth. "Some rooms you walk into to speak. Others just to remind them you were never gone." And with that, the day passed. The headlines faded. But something had shifted. Barron Trump had entered that room certain of his place. He left having learned the weight of words and the cost of ignorance. That stage didn't crown him. It humbled him. And Traoré, he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because some men don't command a room by force. They command it by standing firm when the world expects them to kneel. They mocked him, underestimated him, thought of him as a footnote. But he walked into their world, not to ask for a seat, but to remind them that truth doesn't knock. It walks in when it's ready. He wasn't dressed in gold. He didn't speak with rehearsed flair. But when he stood still, the room moved. And in that silence, something loud happened. The rules began to change. The future isn't always loud. It doesn't always arrive with a last name or a title. Sometimes it shows up quietly and rewrites everything.